part 2 of Go to the Goyim. Leaving Athens, Sha'ul walked to Corinth, about 85 kilometers, or 2 days' journey. Arriving in Corinth, Sha'ul met with Aquilla and his wife Priscilla, who had arrived from Italy, where Luke says the Jews had all been expelled by Emperor Claudius. However, the reason for expulsion is vague, and it appears to have been caused by a constant dispute between the regular synagogue Jews and those who had become believers in Yeshua. So if we turn back to Acts chapter 2, verse 10, to the day of Shavuot 30 CE, the day the Ruach came down upon the 11 emissaries, we see among the crowd there at that time were Jews from Rome. So it may well be that those Jews who had been present at Yerushalayim for Shavuot may well have returned to Rome and caused unrest among the unbelieving Jews. If that is the reason, then Aquila and Priscilla had been expelled from Rome and ended up in Corinth at the same time as Sha'ul. Verse 3 says that when Sha'ul met with Aquila, they discovered that both of them had the same trade as tent makers. So they stayed together for 18 months. While not actually stated, it implies that Aquila and Priscilla were already Messianic Jews when they met Sha'ul. Following his time in Corinth, he walked to the eastern coast port of Cenchrea, and there he sailed to Ephesus, where he stayed only a brief time before sailing on to Caesarea and then up to Yerushalayim for another short visit, and finally he returned to Antioch, Syria. Now Luke compresses all those stops during the latter part of Sha'ul's second journey into 5 short verses between verse 17 and 22. We will look at what Luke has to say in those 5 verses shortly, but let's turn now back and pick up the narrative in chapter 18, verse 4. There, Luke says, Sha'ul began carrying on discussions every Shabbat in the synagogue, where he tried to convince both the Jews and the Greeks. Around that time, Silas and Timothy had arrived from Berea, and Luke also says Sha'ul felt compelled to urgently share the depth and significance of the message about Yeshua. Maybe he had a sense of urgency as a result of what the Ruach had revealed to him when he was in Athens. Week by week, he shared openly with the members of the synagogue. As Corinth is a large city with a very large Jewish population, there were doubtless many synagogues, so that Sha'ul may well have moved around to various communities sharing his message. However, it was not long before the same pattern began to emerge. In verse 6, Luke says, how when they set themselves against him and began hurling insults, he shook his clothes at them and said, your blood is on your heads. For my part, I am clean. From now on, I am going to the Goyim. Once again, we see how the Ruach was guiding him towards the Goyim, the people of the nations. But when we reflect on his words in various letters to the Messianic communities that he had established, we see that at no stage did Sha'ul ever turn his back on his fellow Jews who were unbelievers. Sure, there were many times when he became very frustrated at the response of the unbelieving Jews towards his message, but never did he reject them. So regardless of their response, in every city he visited, he always went to the Jew first. But as his calling from Yeshua was to take the message of redemption to the Goyim, he always encountered strong opposition from the majority in each of the synagogues. So as in verse 7 and 8 says, he left them and went on to the home of a God-fearer named Titus Justus, whose house was right next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the president of the synagogue, came to trust in Yeshua along with the whole of his household. Also, many of the Corinthians heard and trusted and were immersed. Sha'ul, even though he was making good headway with the God-fearers, always felt despondent about the way he'd been rejected by his brothers in the synagogues. However, Yeshua gave him the reassurance he needed. As Luke says, one night in a vision, Yeshua said to Sha'ul, "Don't be afraid, speak up and don't stop, because I am with you. No one will succeed in harming you, for I have many people in this city." So Sha'ul stayed there for a year and a half, teaching the word of God. Being told that no one would succeed in harming him suggests that Sha'ul may well have been reflecting back on the way he'd been treated in Lystra and his first journey, where the mobs, after stoning him, left him for dead. Yeshua clearly wanted to show Sha'ul that he wanted him to stay in Corinth for an extended period. Yeshua said that he had many people in that city who were ready and willing to listen to the message that Sha'ul was sharing. One example was Crispus himself, the president of the synagogue. Even Jews of prominent position like that were listening with intent. So what was the message that Sha'ul was sharing with those Jews and the non-Jews alike? Sha'ul presents the good news about the Tanakh and how it promised everything regarding Yeshua. It is in his own unique way, because unlike the other 11 emissaries, he never saw Yeshua in the flesh. The other 11 had walked with and talked with Yeshua in person during his earthly ministry, and again after his resurrection. Sha'ul, however, did not meet Yeshua until the blinding flash on the road to Damascus. Therefore, his message about Yeshua was based on pure trust and faith. As Yeshua himself said to Thomas, one of the 11, when he appeared in the upper room on the evening following Bikurim, where in John chapter 20 verse 29, Yeshua said, "Have you trusted because you have seen me? How blessed are those who have not seen me, but trust anyway." Trust about things unseen was of paramount importance, particularly to Sha'ul, as we see from his various letters to the Messianic communities. For example, Sha'ul speaks of trust 50 times in his letter to Romans alone, not to mention the other books that also have many references to trust. Sha'ul also expressed the same deep-seated trust in Yeshua when he was speaking with the Corinthians. We see that when we look at the words of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 1, which he wrote a long time after the first visit to Corinth, where he said, "Now, brothers, I must remind you of the good news which I proclaimed to you, and which you received, on which you have taken your stand." So what was the good news that Sha'ul was actually sharing with them? He answers the question in his own words in verses 4 through 8 by saying, "The Messiah died for our sins in accordance with what is written in Tanakh. He was buried, and he was raised on the third day in accordance with what's written in Tanakh. He was seen by Kepha, then by the 12, and afterwards he was seen also by 500 brothers at the one time. Pardon me. The majority of whom are still alive. Later he was seen by Yaakov, then also all the emissaries, and last of all he was seen by me, even though I was born at the wrong time," by which he means, of course, that he who was not privileged to walk with Yeshua in the flesh. Sha'ul then continues by saying, "For I am the least of the emissaries, unfit to be called an emissary, because I persecuted the Messianic community of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace towards me is not in vain. On the contrary, I have worked harder than all of them, although It is not I, but the grace of God within me. This is what I proclaim, and this is what you have believed." Continuing in the same chapter, he also challenges them by saying, "Some in your midst were saying that there's no such thing as a resurrection from the dead." Now, doesn't that sound familiar? In the last episode, we saw how the Epicurean philosophers in Athens challenged his teaching by expressing their belief that there was no life after death. It appears that soon after Sha'ul had left Corinth for the first time, the Epicurean influence tainted some of the fledgling Messianic community. In response to those who were following the Epicurean argument, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, 16 to 17, "If the dead are not raised, then the Messiah has not been raised either. And if the Messiah has not been raised, your trust is useless, and you are still in your sins." He concluded his rebuttal about the Epicurean argument by saying, "If it is for this life and this life alone that you have put your hope in the Messiah, we of all people are the most to be pitied." Returning to Acts chapter 18 verse 12, while Sha'ul was still in Corinth, Gallio became the Roman governor of the western region of Greece. So the unbelieving Jews took advantage of this new Roman governance. Having dragged Sha'ul before the court, in verse 13 Luke says their argument was that this man is trying to persuade people to worship God in a way that violates Torah. However, Gallio ejected the claimants and Sha'ul from his court on the basis that this was a religious matter, not a civil one, and he had no interest in making any ruling. The ironic outcome was, as Luke suggests, is that the believing Jews who had been ejected from the court turned on the president of the synagogue and began beating him in the presence, right there in front of the court. But even that did not catch the attention of Gallio. After 18 months in Corinth, Sha'ul said goodbye to those in the newly formed Messianic community, and with his faithful supporters Silo and Timothy, he departed to the seaport of Cenchrea and headed to Ephesus. He was accompanied on the journey by Aquilla and Priscilla. Then Luke makes reference in verse 18 to Sha'ul having had his hair cut short because he had taken a vow. But Luke gives no further details about the vow, nor the duration, or any of the details relating to that vow. Now, if we assume that it was a Nazirite vow, it certainly would not match the requirements laid down by Yahweh in Bamidbar, Numbers, chapter 6, which specify what is required in relationship to the taking of a Nazirite vow. Furthermore, as David Stern points out in his Jewish New Testament commentary, Sha'ul would not have been shaving his head in Cenchrea, but would have waited until he arrived in Yerushalayim to shave his head, so that he could offer the obligatory sacrifice at the temple. Therefore, it seems highly unlikely that Sha'ul would have been ending his vow in the middle of his second journey, far removed from Yerushalayim, which is totally at odds with what he knew to be required from Torah. I suggest it was much more likely that the end of the vow and the cutting of his hair should be part of chapter 21, where Sha'ul is going to the temple in verse 23, along with 4 men who also were under a vow. In chapter 21, verse 21, Sha'ul has been wrongly accused in that verse of saying, "Now, what the believers have been told is that you are teaching all the Jews living among the Goyim to apostatize from Moshe, telling them not to have Brit Milah for their sons and not to follow the traditions." Yaakov, the Nazi or leader of the Yerushalayim Messianic community, in response to those accusations, said in 21 verse 24, "Take them," that is the 4 men, "with you and purify you with them, be purified with them, and pay the expenses connected with their head being shaved." I think it's an important phrase where it says, "be purified with them." Now, why would Yaakov suggest that Sha'ul be purified if he had not ended his own vow? Therefore, I suggest that the phrase in 18 verse 18, after having cut his hair short in Cenchrea, because he had taken a vow, would be more correctly located between verses 17 and 18 of chapter 21. Then it would read as follows: "In Yerushalayim, the brothers received us warmly. Then after having his hair cut short because of having taken a vow, the next day Sha'ul and the rest of us went to Yaakov, and all the elders were present." Now that makes much more sense. Returning to chapter 18 verse 19, Luke says, "They came to Ephesus, and he left them there, and he himself went into the synagogue and held dialogue with the Jews." From that verse it appears that Sha'ul left Priscilla and Aquilla with the Messianic community in Ephesus, while he alone went into the synagogue. But nothing is said about the type of reception he received. But it must have been a good reception, because in verse 20, the members of the synagogue asked him to stay longer. To which he responded, "God willing, I will come back to you." Then he sailed from Ephesus. After landing in Caesarea, he went up to Yerushalayim and greeted the Messianic community. Then he came back down to Antioch. This is a very abrupt end to Sha'ul's second journey, which lasted for between 2.5 and 3 years. During that time, he had travelled across modern Turkey and Greece and covered an estimated 4,500 kilometres, mostly on foot and by ship. Certainly, that was no small feat that Sha'ul had undertaken, so it really deserves a better conclusion. His return to Antioch should logically have ended the chapter, but then in verse 23, Luke jumps straight forward into the beginning of Sha'ul's third journey by saying he set out and passed systematically through the region of Galatia and strengthened the Talmudim. Then in chapter 19 verse 1, Sha'ul completed his travels through the inland country and arrived at Ephesus, where he found a few Talmudim. However, Luke makes no reference to any travelling companions. Given the region that he walked through to get to Ephesus, there is no way that he would have gone on alone. So who went with him on a third journey? Finally, before chapter 18 closes, we're introduced to yet another character named Apollo. So who was Apollo? Luke says he was a Jew who was a native of Alexandria, who was an eloquent speaker and had a thorough knowledge of Tanakh. Doubtless, he had made a pilgrimage to Yerushalayim during the early stages of Yeshua's earthly ministry. He had been fully informed about Yeshua and the work of the emissaries, and also knew about the immersion of Yochanan. It even suggests that he most likely was immersed by Yochanan in the early stages of his ministry. He was an interesting character because he spoke boldly about Yeshua. As in verse 28 he says, he powerfully and conclusively refuted the unbelieving Jews in public, demonstrating by Tanakh that Yeshua truly was their Mashiach. Some of the modern anti-missionaries who are opposed to the message of Yeshua could do well to listen and take a lesson from Apollo, because they are trying to convince the modern Jews that there is no evidence anywhere in Tanakh that Yeshua is the Mashiach of Israel. Apollo, having come originally from Alexandria, would have been brought up in what we might call Reformed Judaism of the first century. Being a Greek-speaking Jew, he would have been raised learning from the Septuagint version of the Tanakh, which was translated in Alexandria around 200 BCE. Certainly, he would have been able to challenge the Greek-speaking Jews in Corinth and the surrounding region, and with a thorough knowledge of Tanakh, he would be able to show them in their own Greek language that the message about Yeshua was truly true from Tanakh. The strange thing was that even though he had been immersed by Yochanan, he had never been immersed in the name of Yeshua. So he could not have been present at Shavuot gathering in 30 CE, because he had not received the indwelling of the Ruach HaKodesh. So Aquilla and Priscilla were right in taking him aside and explaining the depths of things about the immersion in the name of Yeshua, because only then did he receive the promised Ruach HaKodesh. Luke also mentions him as being a powerful speaker in the name of Yeshua in and around Corinth. And he was well received by the Talmudim in that region. In fact, his name appears 7 times in Sha'ul's first letter to the Corinthians, but at no stage did he ever act as an emissary. That role was exclusively for Sha'ul, as Yeshua's only choice being the one to take the message to the Goyim. In fact, we see that after Sha'ul's second and possibly third visit to Corinth, the believers were comparing Sha'ul, Kepha, and Apollo as their means of redemption. In response, Sha'ul writes to them, saying in 1 Corinthians 1:12-16, "I say this, that one of you says, I follow Sha'ul, another says, I follow Apollo, another says, I follow Kepha, while still another says, I follow the Messiah. Has the Messiah been split into pieces? Was it Sha'ul who was put to death for your sake? Were you immersed into the name of Sha'ul? Thank God I didn't immerse any except Crispus and Gaius. Otherwise, someone might say that you were indeed immersed in my name." So we can see from these words that even in the first century, there were constant divisions between various groups of people, even within the first century Messianic community. But the pattern is the same all over the region and beyond, and it is still just as prevalent today. So in conclusion, we can see yet again that there is a constant struggle between the unbelieving Jews in the synagogues and the believing Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles. We see from chapter 18 again that it was Sha'ul alone who was sent to the Goyim. The other 11 emissaries were sent to other groups of Jews in various unspecified parts of the diaspora. We have seen also that there has been some mix-up in the narrative that has been transmitted down through the many languages, where those mistakes were either made accidentally or intentionally. That is still debatable. But overall, the message of Acts gives us a solid foundation for the consideration of Sha'ul's letters to the various communities that he formed and nurtured. Acts is like a really well set out and well developed travelogue of Sha'ul's travels and journeys, and about his companions. And we should always consider it as being just that. So next Shabbat, we will set out again with Sha'ul on his third journey back through Galatia and beyond. So as always, until then, Shabbat Shalom.